How does the wisest man in history leave behind the most broken legacy? For a century, Israel was a golden empire, a masterpiece built with blood and divine wisdom. But look closer. Behind the temple's 20 tons of gold, a heart was growing rusty. In just 72 hours, a single arrogant sentence erased 100 years of glory, turning gold shields into worthless bronze. Why do we keep building monuments to our ego while our foundation rots? This isn't just about ancient kings. It's about why greatness falls and the unexpected answer hidden in the ruins. To understand how a kingdom falls, we first have to understand the grit it took to build it. Long before the gold of Solomon or the majesty of the temple, Israel was little more than a whisper in a world of giants. For centuries, they were a loose collection of 12 scattered tribes, nomadic shepherds struggling to survive in the shadows of great empires. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and for a long time, they were losing. Their survival was pushed to the brink by a wicked and technologically superior enemy, the Philistines. The Philistines didn't just want land, they wanted to erase Israel's identity. Facing total annihilation, the 12 tribes made a desperate demand that would change their history forever. Give us a king to rule over us. They wanted a leader to unite their fractured spirits into a single fist. Saul was that first king. He was the one who sparked the vision of a unified nation, rallying the tribes to stand against their oppressors. But Saul's story is a tragedy of the highest order. His reign didn't end in a palace, it ended in blood on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. After watching his sons fall to Philistine archers and fearing the humiliation of capture, Saul fell on his own sword. The ultimate insult followed his death. His body was beheaded and displayed as a trophy on a pagan city wall. It seemed the dream of a united Israel had died with him. But where Saul failed, a young shepherd named David succeeded. David didn't just defend borders, he redrew the geography of their hope. He captured the strategic stronghold of Jerusalem, making it a capital that belonged to all 12 tribes. From his youth, when he struck down the giant Goliath with a single stone, to his series of decisive military campaigns, David transformed a band of survivors into a legitimate power. He didn't just push the Philistines back, he crushed them in their own territory, subduing the very enemies who had terrorized his people for generations. Yet as grand as this story sounds, it has long been the center of a fierce debate. When we talk about archaeology, we often face a different kind of war, the battle between what is written in the sacred texts and what actually remains beneath the soil. For decades, skeptics argued that David was nothing more than a myth, a legendary figure invented to give a small nation a sense of pride. They pointed out that if David was truly the head of a mighty empire, why was the physical evidence so sparse? But archaeology eventually weighed in. In northern Israel, archaeologists uncovered an ancient stone monument known as the Tel Dan Stele. On it, an enemy king from the 9th century BC boasts about his victory over the house of David. This single piece of basalt confirmed what many had doubted. David was a real historical figure whose dynasty was significant enough for his enemies to record. However, we must understand the silence of history. In the world of archaeology, there is a vital principle. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Ancient kings rarely carved monuments to their defeats, and conquerors often leveled cities to the ground, erasing the glory of those they replaced. David may not have ruled a vast empire of stone and marble from the start, but his true legacy wasn't found in the height of his walls. His legacy was the structure he built, a government, a military, and a national soul. David was more than just a warrior who defeated the Philistines, Moabites, and Arameans. He was the architect of an administrative machine that his son Solomon would eventually use to turn a kingdom into an international superpower. David provided the security in the capital, but it was the era of Solomon that would test whether that foundation was built on something stronger than gold. Solomon was brilliant, and he stepped into power at a unique moment in history. The great empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia were weak, distracted by their own internal collapses. There was a power vacuum in the region, and Solomon seized it. But unlike his father, Solomon didn't build his power through the sword. Instead, he used wisdom, diplomacy, and trade to turn Israel into the hub of the known world. Yet as the wealth began to pour in from every corner of the earth, the very system that made the kingdom rich began to create the cracks that would eventually tear it apart. The gold was arriving by the ton, but the cost of that prosperity was higher than anyone realized. The question wasn't how much wealth Solomon could accumulate, but what happened to the heart of the nation when the weights and measures of their success began to shift? Where did all that gold really come from? And more importantly, what was it doing to the people who were forced to carry it? Solomon's reign was a miracle of diplomacy and gold. Unlike his father David, Solomon didn't build his power through the sword or constant conquest. Instead, he relied on something far more modern: trade, wisdom, and strategic alliances. In his time, the great powers of Egypt and Mesopotamia were preoccupied with their own troubles, creating a vacuum that Solomon filled with astonishing speed. Israel became the hub of the known world, a massive highway for wealth that ran through the heart of the Middle East. But where did all that gold come from? It wasn't just luck. Solomon was a master of logistics. He controlled the trade routes like the Via Maris, a major international artery traveled by merchants from Africa and Asia. Every merchant who passed through had to pay a toll, and every caravan that stopped in his cities left behind a piece of their fortune in taxes. The wealth pouring in was so vast that the Bible records silver became as common as stones in the streets of Jerusalem. Yet there is a specific number that stands out in the historical records, a number that serves as a chilling signal of what was happening behind the scenes. The weight of the gold Solomon received yearly was 666 talents. That comes to a staggering 23 tons of gold every single year. For centuries, people have debated the meaning of this number, but in the context of Solomon's story, it represents something far more profound than just a sum of money. In ancient texts, the number 6666 is often a warning code, a threshold where human effort attempts to replace divine guidance. It was the threshold of prosperity. When a leader begins to count their success solely in tons of gold and the weight of their treasury, they are hitting a dangerous limit. Solomon had achieved the impossible, but he had also reached a point where his ego was beginning to outgrow his wisdom. He had broken the golden rule of humility. This wasn't just a fortune. It was a warning that the king's heart was beginning to shift from the spirit of the law to the power of the material world. We see this shift most clearly in his monumental building projects. Solomon's crown jewel was the temple in Jerusalem. It was a wonder of the ancient world, covered in nearly 20 tons of gold and dedicated to the glory of God. It took 7 years of intense labor to complete. It was a masterpiece, but consider this. While he spent 7 years building a house for God, he spent 13 years building his own palace. Think about that discrepancy. 13 years for his own luxury compared to 7 for the divine. Solomon was pouring nearly double the time, double the resources, and double the effort into his own house, the house of the forest of Lebanon. He filled it with 300 shields made of pure gold, not for battle, but for display. It was a monument to his own shadow, a palace built to feed a pride that had become insatiable. The man who was once the wisest in history was now falling into the oldest trap of all, the belief that he was the source of his own greatness. To maintain this level of luxury, Solomon devised a system that was efficient on paper but disastrous in reality. He split the land into 12 administrative districts, ignoring the age-old tribal boundaries that had defined the identity of the people for centuries. Each district was forced to supply the king's palace for 1 month out of the year. This wasn't just a simple tax, it was an extraction machine. His officials collected 30 kor of fine flour, 60 kor of meal, and 10 fattened oxen every single day just to feed the palace. And all of this came primarily from the northern tribes. While the north labored in the copper mines and fields, Solomon's own tribe, Judah, was exempt from the heaviest burdens. Resentment wasn't just growing, it was boiling. The trap of prosperity was now fully set. On the surface, Israel looked like an indestructible empire. It was a fortress of gold and silver, guarded by a massive army and secured by trade routes that reached as far as Spain and the mysterious land of Ophir. Merchants brought back ivory, timber, and even exotic animals to entertain the court. But look beneath the surface. The foundation was no longer made of the solid stone of David's loyalty. It was made of the sweat and anger of a people who felt used by their king. Solomon believed he was so wise that he could flirt with idolatry without losing his soul. He married hundreds of foreign princesses to seal political treaties, and to please them, he built altars to their gods, Chemosh, Moloch, and Ashtoreth. He believed God's rules were for commoners, not for a king as brilliant as him. But he was wrong. The same heart that had once asked for wisdom was now drifting away, distracted by the very wealth that wisdom had created. The king who had built a house for God was now building a house for himself that overshadowed it in every way. The wealth had become a wall, separating the leader from his people and the man from his maker. Everything looked perfect for the coronation of his son, Rehoboam, but the kingdom was a tinderbox, and the people were exhausted. The golden shields in the palace were beautiful to look at, but they were heavy, too heavy for the people to carry much longer. All that was needed was one small spark, one moment of pride, for the entire 100-year legacy to go up in flames. And that spark was about to come from the mouth of a young king who thought he was untouchable. The golden era of Solomon did not end with a slow, graceful decline. It ended with a sudden, violent crash. When the news of Solomon's death spread, the atmosphere in the land wasn't just one of mourning, it was one of intense, suffocating tension. The 100-year legacy of a united Israel was now in the hands of his son, Rehoboam. But to be crowned, Rehoboam had to do something unexpected. He didn't stay in the safety of Jerusalem. He traveled north to Shechem. Shechem was not just any city. It was sacred ground, heavy with the history of Abraham and the covenants of Joshua. But more importantly, it was the heart of the northern tribes' discontent. They weren't there to celebrate a coronation. They were there to negotiate for their lives. And leading them was Jeroboam, the man who had once overseen Solomon's forced labor and had now returned from exile in Egypt to stand as the voice of the exhausted. The request was simple, yet it held the weight of decades of suffering. Jeroboam looked the new king in the eye and said, "Your father made our yoke heavy. Now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." This was the moment of truth. The future of a superpower rested on one decision. Would the new king see the people's pain, or would he only see his own crown? Rehoboam asked for 3 days to think. In those 72 hours, the destiny of millions was decided in the halls of power. First, Rehoboam turned to the elders, the men who had served his father Solomon. These men had seen the glory, but they had also seen the cost. Their advice was filled with a wisdom that Solomon himself had forgotten. If today you will be a servant to these people and serve them, they will be your servants forever. It was a profound philosophy of leadership. To lead is to serve. They were telling the king that humility is the only glue that can hold a fractured nation together. But Rehoboam didn't want to hear about humility. To a young king raised in the luxury of a palace, the word servant felt like an insult. Instead, he turned to the young men he had grown up with, the palace elite, who had never felt the bite of a taskmaster's whip or the heat of a copper mine. These men viewed leadership through the lens of ego and domination. Their advice was the opposite. Show them who is boss. Tell them you are even tougher than your father. When the 3 days were up, the people returned to Shechem, holding their breath. Rehoboam stood before them, not with the heart of a servant, but with the arrogance of a tyrant. He rejected the wise counsel of the elders and chose the path of the scorpions. He spoke those infamous words that still echo as a warning to every leader. "My father made your yoke heavy. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." In ancient times, a scorpion wasn't just an animal. It was a terrifying kind of whip studded with bits of metal or sharp bone designed to tear the skin. Rehoboam wasn't just promising higher taxes. He was promising a reign of terror. He believed that by flexing his ego, he would solidify his power. But this is the legacy of the scorpions, a lesson that history repeats in every age, from ancient empires to modern boardrooms and even within our own homes. Why do we see great families, communities, or nations shatter in a matter of days? It is rarely because of outside enemies. It is almost always because someone in a position of power chose their own ego over the connection to those they were meant to care for. Think about the conflicts in your own life. How many times has a little finger of pride, the need to be right, the need to be the most powerful person in the room, cut a family or a relationship in half? When Rehoboam compared his little finger to his father's waist, he wasn't just being vulgar, he was revealing a soul that had become entirely disconnected from the people he ruled. He saw them as tools to be used, not a family to be led. When we choose the way of the scorpion, when we use our words to sting and our power to crush rather than to heal, we are doing exactly what Rehoboam did. We are setting fire to a legacy we didn't even build. We are sacrificing a century of unity on the altar of a 3-day ego trip. This isn't just ancient politics, it's a mirror for us today. It's a warning that the real test of any leader, parent, or friend is whether they can set aside their pride for the sake of reconciliation. The response from the people was immediate and irreversible. The air in Shechem turned cold. The 10 northern tribes realized that the house of David no longer cared for them. The cry went out, "What share do we have in David? To your tents, O Israel." In that single moment of pride, the kingdom was ripped apart. The 10 northern tribes formed their own nation, leaving Rehoboam with only the small southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin. Solomon had spent 40 years building the most magnificent kingdom the world had ever seen, and his son wrecked it in just 3 days because he refused to listen. Rehoboam was stunned. He tried to send his chief taskmaster, Adoniram, to force the people back into submission. It was a move of pure tone deafness. Sending the man who symbolized their slavery to talk about peace was like pouring gasoline on a wildfire. The people stoned Adoniram to death, and Rehoboam barely escaped to Jerusalem in his chariot, fleeing like a fugitive from his own people. The split was now final. There was no going back. The united kingdom of David and Solomon was dead, replaced by 2 rival nations that would spend centuries fighting, betraying, and mourning what they had lost. The golden shields were still in the palace, but the heart of the nation was broken. All because one man thought his little finger was more important than the covenant that held his brothers together. The tragedy of Israel had begun, and as the dust settled in Shechem, a new and darker chapter was being written, one that would lead them all into a shadow they never expected. The unified vision of David and Solomon didn't just crack, it shattered into high, distinct, warring entities. To the north stood the new kingdom of Israel, led by the rebel-turned King Jeroboam. To the south, the kingdom of Judah remained under the prideful Rehoboam. But as the borders were drawn in the sand, the real tragedy wasn't the loss of land. It was the slow, agonizing decay of the nation's soul. We are witnessing the fall of substance, a time when the weight of a people's character was traded for the shine of an imitation. Jeroboam was a king consumed by political anxiety. He had the land and he had the people, but he didn't have the temple. Jerusalem, the spiritual heartbeat of the nation, sat firmly in the territory of his enemy. He feared that if his subjects traveled south to worship at the temple of God, their hearts would eventually follow their feet, and they would kill him to return to the house of David. Instead of trusting in the promise God had made to him, Jeroboam took matters into his own hands with a calculated act of spiritual treason. He commissioned 2 golden calves, idols that mirrored the pagan bull gods of Egypt, and placed them at the strategic edges of his kingdom in Bethel and Dan. "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem," he told the people. "Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." It was a lie built on insecurity. He wasn't giving them a new way to worship. He was giving them a spiritual cage to keep them from leaving his borders. It became known as the sin of Jeroboam, a dark stain that would haunt the northern kingdom for every generation that followed. But the decay didn't stop at idols. To maintain this new system, Jeroboam had to systematically dismantle the ancient structures of the faith. Since the faithful Levites and priests refused to serve his golden calves and fled to the south, Jeroboam created a new priesthood. He didn't care about lineage or holiness. He appointed anyone who wanted the job. He changed the dates of the sacred feasts, shifting the calendar to suit his own political schedule. The sacred was becoming common. The eternal was being exchanged for the convenient. This was the cheapening of the spirit. It's the belief that you can keep the outward form of a tradition while discarding its heart. The northern kingdom was still Israel, but it was an Israel that had traded its covenant for a pedestal. They were worshiping the creature instead of the creator, and when you devalue your ultimate source of truth, everything else begins to lose its worth. While the north was trading its soul for idols, The south was about to lose its treasure. 5 years into Rehoboam's reign, the vulnerability of a divided house became an invitation to predators. Pharaoh Shishak of Egypt, the same man who had once sheltered Jeroboam, saw his opportunity. He marched into Judah with a massive army of 1,200 chariots and 60,000 cavalry. He didn't just conquer cities, he struck at the very pride of the nation. Shishak entered Jerusalem and plundered the Temple of Solomon, stripping away the riches that had once astonished the world. This is where we see the most tragic symbol of this entire era, the metaphor of the bronze shields. Solomon had built 300 shields of pure hammered gold. They were iconic symbols of a kingdom that was once so wealthy that silver was considered as common as stones. These shields were kept in the palace of the Forest of Lebanon, reflecting the light and glory of a nation at its peak. Shishak took them all. Every single one was hauled back to Egypt as a trophy. Instead of falling on his knees in repentance for the sins that led to this loss, Rehoboam did something that perfectly illustrates the human condition. He tried to hide the loss. He couldn't afford gold anymore, so he commissioned 300 new shields made of bronze. He gave them to the guards of the palace, and every time he entered the temple, the guards would carry them. Look at the contrast. Gold is a noble metal. It never tarnishes, it reflects light perfectly, and it is a gift of the earth. Bronze is an alloy, a human-made imitation. It looks like gold from a distance, but it requires constant, exhausting polishing just to keep from turning dull. This was the reality of the divided kingdoms. They were living in an era of bronze glory. They were going through the motions, polishing their imitations, and pretending they were still the chosen people of the Golden Age. But the substance was gone. The glory had departed, and all that was left was a hollow facade. The temple was still standing, but its treasures were in Egypt. The tribes were still called Israel, but they were worshiping bulls. The line of David was still on the throne, but they were carrying shields of bronze. The spiritual currency of the nation had been devalued, and as we see throughout history, when the values of a people collapse, chaos is never far behind. In the north, the royal palace became a revolving door of betrayal. One king would murder another just to seize a throne that was already sinking. In just 200 years, Israel would go through 19 kings from 9 different families. Chaos became the norm. The house of Omri and the wicked king Ahab would eventually lead the people even deeper into the darkness, replacing the golden calves with the even more violent worship of Baal. The people had forgotten who they were. They were no longer a family. They were a collection of warring tribes, clutching their bronze shields and praying to silent idols. The stage was set for a total collapse. It would take more than a king or an army to fix this. It would take a voice from the wilderness, a man of fire who wasn't afraid to tell the truth to a king. But before we meet the prophet Elijah, we must see just how deep the darkness went when a queen named Jezebel decided to finish what Jeroboam had started. The fire was about to fall, but it wouldn't come from a palace. It would come from a mountain. As the northern kingdom of Israel sank deeper into the worship of Baal, the God of their fathers seemed like a distant, flickering memory. Under the reign of King Ahab and his ruthless Phoenician queen, Jezebel, the spiritual landscape had become a wasteland. The prophets of the Lord were hunted like animals, executed in the streets, or forced into hiding in dark, damp caves. Pagan altars stood on every high hill, and the national identity was being systematically erased. In this era of total spiritual drought, a man appeared who belonged to neither the palace nor the priesthood. Elijah was a man of the wilderness, wearing a garment of hair and a leather belt, a voice of fire crying out in an age of ice. He stood before Ahab and declared a curse of drought that would last for years, forcing a final confrontation that would decide the very soul of the nation. The stage for this epic showdown was Mount Carmel, a high ridge overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. It was an image of absolute contrast. 450 prophets of the storm god Baal on one side, and one lone weathered man of God on the other. The challenge Elijah proposed was simple, yet it held the weight of eternity. 2 altars would be built, 2 sacrifices would be prepared, but no fire would be lit by human hands. The God who answers by fire, Elijah declared to the silent, watching crowds, he is God. For hours, the prophets of Baal took center stage. They shouted, they danced frantically around their altar, and they eventually began to slash themselves with swords and spears until their blood flowed, begging for a single spark from their silent deity. But there was nothing. No voice, no answer, and no fire. By noon, Elijah began to mock them with a biting sarcasm that cut through their desperation. "Shout louder," he suggested. "Maybe your God is busy, or traveling, or perhaps he is fast asleep and needs to be awakened." By evening, the prophets of Baal had collapsed in exhaustion and shame. The silence on the mountain was agonizing. Then it was Elijah's turn, but before he prayed for fire, he did something highly intentional and deeply symbolic. He stepped toward the ruins of an ancient altar of the Lord that had been torn down during the purges. He took 12 stones, not 10 to represent the northern kingdom he stood in, and not 2 for the southern kingdom of Judah. He took 12. Each stone represented one of the tribes of the sons of Jacob. In that moment, with a simple pile of rocks, Elijah was sending a message that transcended the politics of the day. He was declaring that even though the land was fractured by human pride and divided by borders, in the eyes of the Creator, they were still one people, one family, and one covenant. He was rebuilding a unity that had been shattered at Shechem centuries before. To make the miracle humanly impossible, Elijah ordered the people to drench the altar with water. They poured 4 large jars over the sacrifice and the wood, once, twice, and a third time, until the water overflowed and filled a trench around the base. The altar was a sodden, dripping mess. Then in the quiet of the evening sacrifice, Elijah stepped forward and prayed a simple, humble prayer of 63 words. He didn't shout or cut himself. He simply asked God to prove who he was for the sake of the people's hearts. At that very moment, the fire of the Lord fell from a clear sky. It didn't just burn the sacrifice. It consumed the wood, the 12 stones, the very soil beneath them, and it licked up every drop of water in the trench. The crowd was paralyzed by the sheer, terrifying majesty of the moment. They fell on their faces, crying out in a single voice, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" The 450 prophets of Baal were seized and executed, and as Elijah climbed to the top of the mountain to pray, a small cloud the size of a man's hand appeared on the horizon. Within minutes, the sky turned black, and the 3-year drought was broken by a torrential, life-giving rain. It was the greatest victory in the history of the prophets. However, we often celebrate Elijah as an invincible hero, a man made of iron who could never be shaken. But what happened next is one of the most honest and raw accounts of the human condition ever recorded. When the news of the slaughter reached Queen Jezebel, she didn't repent. She sent a messenger to Elijah with a vow to have his head by the following day. And in that moment, the man who had just called fire from heaven and faced down an army of false prophets snapped. Elijah was terrified. He fled for his life, running over 100 miles into the wilderness of Beersheba. He sat down under a solitary broom tree, exhausted and broken, and he prayed a prayer that no one expected. "I have had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." This wasn't just simple fear. It was a total mental and emotional collapse. Modern psychologists would recognize this as the onset of PTSD, the crushing weight of trauma after years of being a fugitive, living in constant survival mode, and bearing the spiritual burden of an entire nation on his shoulders. The fire on Mount Carmel had been the peak, but Jezebel's threat was the final straw for a soul that was already running on empty. He felt utterly alone, convinced that despite the miracle, nothing had really changed. But look at how God responded to this broken man. He didn't scold him for his lack of courage or demand he go back to the front lines immediately. Instead, he provided for Elijah's physical needs. He sent an angel to bake him bread and give him water, and then he let him sleep. God understood that a shattered spirit often needs a rested body first. After 40 days of wandering, Elijah ended up in a cave on Mount Horeb, the same mountain where Moses had once received the law. There, God invited Elijah out of the cave to stand in his presence. First, a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks, but the Lord was not in the wind. Then came a violent earthquake that shook the foundation of the world, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After that, a raging fire swept through the pass, but the Lord was not in the fire. Finally, after the chaos and the noise, there came a gentle whisper, a still, small voice. Elijah wrapped his face in his cloak and stepped out. In that whisper, God didn't offer a new miracle. He offered a perspective. He told Elijah that he was not the only one left, that there were still 7,000 in Israel who had never bowed their knees to Baal. He gave him a new mission and a successor, Elisha, so he wouldn't have to carry the weight alone anymore. Elijah's true victory wasn't the fire that consumed the stones on Carmel. It was the whisper that restored his soul in the cave. It is a reminder for us today that the loudest moments in our lives aren't always the most significant. Sometimes God's greatest work happens not in the roar of the earthquake, but in the quietness of a heart being mended. The kingdom was still divided, and the kings were still wicked, but the voice of the whisper remained. The fire had proven who God was, but the whisper proved how much he cared. And as Elijah stepped out of that cave, he wasn't just a prophet again. He was a man who knew that even when the fire goes out, the hope remains. But as the era of the prophets continued, the shadows of the coming empires were already beginning to stretch across the land. While the fire on Mount Carmel proved who God was, it didn't stop the gears of history from grinding toward a tragic end. The spiritual rot that began with Solomon's pride and Jeroboam's idols had become a terminal illness. For the next 3 centuries, the story of God's people was a slow-motion car crash, a series of warnings ignored, and a legacy being dismantled piece by piece. But in the midst of this unfolding disaster, something remarkable was happening. In the shadows of these crumbling kingdoms, voices began to rise. They were the prophets, and they weren't just predicting the weather or the next war. They were revealing a divine script that had been written long before the first stone of the temple was ever laid. To understand the sheer scale of this divine foresight, we have to look back at a moment that seemed like a minor footnote. 300 years before the final collapse, while Jeroboam was still standing at his false altar in Bethel, a nameless prophet appeared with a message that should have frozen the king's blood. He didn't just speak of a vague future judgment. He spoke a name. He cried out against the altar and declared, "A son named Josiah will be born to the house of David. On you he will sacrifice the priests of the high places." Think about the magnitude of that statement. This wasn't a general "someone will come." This was a specific name, assigned to a specific royal line, 3 centuries before he was even born. It is the equivalent of someone today standing in a seat of power and naming a specific leader who will rise in the year 2325. When Jeroboam tried to have the prophet arrested, his hands shriveled and locked in place, a physical sign that time itself was under a different authority. This was the Josiah prophecy, a reminder that even in the chaos of division, God was already preparing the cleanup crew. History wasn't a series of accidents, it was an appointment. But as the years turned into centuries, the northern kingdom of Israel finally hit its limit. In 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire, the most brutal war machine of the ancient world, swept down and erased the 10 tribes from the map. They were deported, scattered, and became the lost tribes of Israel. Now only the small southern kingdom of Judah remained, clutching the ruins of David's dream. But they hadn't learned the lesson. They watched their brothers fall, and yet they continued to polish their bronze shields, believing the temple in Jerusalem was a magic charm that would protect them from their own rot. It was in this atmosphere of impending doom that the weeping prophet Jeremiah emerged. Jeremiah lived through the final agonizing days of Jerusalem before it fell to the Babylonians. He saw the walls breached and the temple burned to the ground. But in the middle of that literal Jongjo-nat, Jeremiah didn't speak of rebuilding walls or recoating shields in gold. He spoke of a new covenant. He told a people who had lost everything that the problem wasn't their lack of a temple, it was their lack of a heart. "The days are coming," he declared, "when I will make a new covenant with the people. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts." This was a revolutionary shift in the software of faith. For centuries, the law had been something external, written on heavy stone tablets, housed in a golden box, in a building made of cedar and stone. But stones can be broken, and buildings can be burned. Jeremiah was announcing a move from the external to the internal. God was no longer going to be out there in a physical building. He was going to be in here, in the very fabric of human desire and thought. The covenant was being moved from the archive to the bloodstream. It was the promise that even when the national structure collapses, the relationship survives. While Jeremiah was weeping in the ruins of Jerusalem, another prophet named Ezekiel was already in exile in Babylon. He was living among the refugees, people who felt like dry bones bleached by the sun. They believed the division of Shechem was final, that the 12 tribes were gone forever. But God gave Ezekiel a strange, simple prop for a sermon: 2 wooden sticks. On one stick, Ezekiel wrote for Judah, and on the other, for Israel. Then God told him to hold them together in his hand so they became one. It was a visual remix of history. God was saying that the fracture of Rehoboam's pride and Jeroboam's rebellion was not the final word. The sticks weren't being glued together by human politics. They were being fused by a divine hand. Ezekiel's vision was a promise of a total restoration, a day when the family would no longer be defined by the borders of the north or the south, but by a single shepherd. These prophets were sowing seeds of hope in a graveyard. They were telling a people who had traded their gold for bronze that something far more valuable than gold was coming. They were preparing them for a time when the house of David would no longer be a political dynasty in a small Middle Eastern city, but a global reality. They saw through the ruins of the present to a future Messiah, the Anointed One. This king wouldn't repeat the mistakes of Solomon's ego or Rehoboam's scorpion whips. He would fulfill the Josiah prophecy on a cosmic scale, tearing down every false altar and rebuilding the bridge between the Creator and the created. The history of the 12 tribes was moving toward a climax that no one in the palace of Jerusalem or the temples of Bethel could have imagined. The gold was gone, the temple was in ashes, and the people were in chains. But the word of the prophets was vibrating with a new kind of power. The stage was being cleared of the physical clutter, the kings, the armies, and the stone altars, to make room for something deeper. The era of the Vuong Quoc Tamlin was about to begin, and it would take a man from a small, insignificant village in Galilee to show them that the greatest kingdom of all has no borders, no taxes, and no bronze imitations. It only has a table and a seat for every lost tribe to finally come home. But as the centuries of silence began after the last prophet spoke, the world waited, not for another king with a sword, but for a king who would conquer by laying his own life down. For 400 years, the skies over Israel were silent. No prophets, no fire from heaven, no whispers in the cave. The people were living in the fading memory of a golden age that was long gone, buried under the weight of Roman taxes and the debris of failed rebellions. They were waiting for a new David, a warrior king with a sword who would restore the borders and sit on a throne of gold. They expected a lion, but when the Messiah finally appeared, he didn't come with an army or the arrogance of a palace. He came from a small, dusty village in the north, born in a manger, the son of a carpenter. This was the grand paradox. If the kingdom split was born from the pride of a king's little finger, then the healing would come through the wounded hands of a servant. Jesus was a king who didn't extract taxes. He gave his life. He didn't build a palace for 13 years. He lived as a wanderer with no place to lay his head. Every action he took was a deliberate remix of the old broken kingdom. Solomon had 700 wives for political leverage. Jesus had 12 disciples to show the power of a new family. Solomon built a temple of stone and gold that could be plundered. Jesus told the people that he himself was the temple that would be destroyed and raised in 3 days. The world simply didn't understand. They wanted a Messiah who would fight the Romans and bring back the gold shields. Instead, they got a Messiah who washed feet and wore a crown of thorns. They wanted a kingdom with borders. He gave them a kingdom of the heart. This came to a head at the cross. The Romans placed a sign above him, King of the Jews. They thought it was a mockery, but in reality it was the fulfillment of the ancient covenant in a way no one expected. By dying, he broke the cycle of pride and revenge. By rising, he showed that the true throne isn't in a city called Jerusalem, it's in the heavens. But the most astonishing part of this story happened 50 days after he rose. This was the Feast of Pentecost. Imagine the scene. Jerusalem was packed with people from every nation under heaven. The 12 tribes were no longer a unified nation, but a scattered people, speaking dozens of different languages. Remember the Tower of Babel? Thousands of years before, God had confused the languages of humanity to scatter a prideful people who wanted to build their own monument to the sky. And remember the division at Shechem? Language and tribal pride had split the family of Jacob into two warring houses. At Pentecost, God reversed the curse. As the disciples prayed, the Holy Spirit descended like tongues of fire. Suddenly, they began to speak in languages they had never learned. But here is the miracle. Every person from every tribe and every nation heard the message in their own native tongue. The barriers that had divided humanity for millennia began to crumble. What the 12 tribes could Bao achieve through politics or armies, God was accomplishing through the remix of language. He wasn't giving them a new government. He was giving them a new heart. This was the decentralization of faith. For centuries, the faith of Israel had been tied to a physical location. You had to go to Jerusalem. You had to offer sacrifices at a specific altar in a specific building. It was a centralized system. And like all centralized systems, it was vulnerable to corruption and destruction. When the Romans eventually leveled the temple in 70 AD, many thought it was the end of the world. But they were wrong. The destruction of the physical building was actually the final step in God's plan to set the faith free. He was moving the Holy of Holies from a room made of cedar and gold into the very center of the human spirit. This is the ultimate shift. Instead of a building of stone, God was building a community of living stones. Each person became a mobile temple, carrying the presence of the Creator into every corner of the known world. Think about the beauty of this evolution. A physical temple can be plundered by a pharaoh. Its gold can be stolen and traded for bronze by a foolish king. It can be burned to the ground by a Babylonian general. But a temple of the heart is indestructible. It has no borders for an army to breach. It has no treasury for a thief to steal. Faith was no longer something you went to. It was something you became. This was the kingdom without borders. It didn't matter if you were from the lost tribes of the north or the remnants of the south. It didn't matter if you were Jew or Greek, slave or free. In this new covenant, everyone was family. The 12 stones Elijah had set up on Mount Carmel weren't just a memory anymore. They were a living reality. The division that began with Rehoboam's pride was finally being healed by Jesus' humility. Jesus once met a Samaritan woman by a well. The Samaritans were the descendants of those northern tribes, the ones who had worshipped at Bethel instead of Jerusalem for centuries. The old debate was still raging. Where is the right place to worship? And Jesus told her something that changed the world. A time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. The true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. He was telling her that the map of faith was being redrawn. The old borders were gone. The sin of Jeroboam was washed away. The pride of Rehoboam was replaced by a new law of service. The 12 tribes that had torn themselves apart from the inside were now being knit back together in a way that would never break again. The software of the heart was now fully installed. The glory of God no longer depended on how much gold was on the walls or whether the shields were made of gold or bronze. The glory of God was now reflected in the lives of people who practiced mercy, justice, and love. The kingdom had been remixed, from a political empire to a spiritual movement, from a physical building to a global family. If the kingdom of Solomon failed because it built its towers on the sand of human pride, this new kingdom was built on the rock of divine love. The 12 tribes had found their center again, not in a king on a throne, but in a savior on a cross. But how does this story actually end? If the kingdom of gold on earth failed so spectacularly, what does the final kingdom look like? The book of Revelation gives us a vision that ties every single thread of this 1,000-year story together. It shows us a city that isn't built on the sand of human pride, but on the foundation of a love that has been tested by fire. And as we look at the final chapter, we realize that the story of the 12 tribes was never just about a piece of land in the Middle East. It was about a home for the whole world. The final book of the Bible, Revelation, gives us a breathtaking vision of how this 1,000-year tragedy finally resolves. It describes a city called the New Jerusalem, descending out of heaven, and it is a masterpiece of symmetry and reconciliation. The city has 12 gates, and on each gate is carved the name of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. It also has 12 foundations, and on them are the names of the 12 apostles. Think about the profound beauty of that union. The old and the new, the ancient tribes and the humble apostles, are no longer separated by time or sin or borders. They are gathered into a single eternal city. The division that began with Rehoboam's pride and Jeroboam's rebellion at Shechem is finally permanently healed. The 10 tribes that were lost to the Assyrian miss and the 2 that were broken by Babylonian chains are home. The gates are never shut because there is no longer a need to protect the gold from thieves or the people from enemies. But there is a shocking detail in this final vision. There is no temple. Solomon spent 7 years building a house of cedar and gold, and he spent 13 years building a palace for himself. For centuries, the people believed that God lived only in a specific room, behind a thick curtain, in a building made of stone. But in the New Jerusalem, the Creator doesn't live in a building. He lives with His people. The glory doesn't need to be reflected in gold shields or polished bronze imitations anymore, because the glory is the light itself. The software of the heart that Jeremiah promised is now the very atmosphere of the city. This is the ultimate remix of power. For thousands of years, we have seen kings like Saul, David, Solomon, and Rehoboam try to hold a nation together through force, taxation, and ego. Rehoboam thought leadership was defined by the thickness of his little finger and the sting of his scorpions. He believed that to be a king was to dominate, but the king of this new Jerusalem showed us a different way. He proved that true power is found in the basin and the towel. He showed us that the greatest in the kingdom is the one who serves the most. It is an upside-down kingdom where the last are first and the humble are the truly exalted. As we look at the ruins of ancient Israel, the archaeology of the Tel Dan Stele, and the tragic exchange of gold for bronze, we have to stop looking at them as just ancient history. This story is a mirror. You have to ask yourself, what kind of kingdom are you building in your own life? We all have a kingdom, our families, our careers, our personal legacies. And like Solomon, we are all prone to building monuments to our own egos while our foundations rot. We spend 13 years building our own palaces, focusing on our comfort, our status, and our pride, while spending only 7 years or perhaps no time at all on the things that actually matter to the soul. Are you using scorpions in your own relationships? Are you using harsh words, rigid pride, and the need to be right to maintain control over your tribe, only to watch your family or your community rip itself apart from the inside? We often think we are being strong when we flex our little finger, but Rehoboam proves that pride is actually the ultimate weakness. It is the weight that crushes the very thing it tries to hold. Many of us are living in an era of bronze shields. We've lost the gold, the genuine connection, the authentic faith, the real peace, and we've replaced it with an imitation. We go through the motions. We polish our social media profiles, we perform our rituals, and we pretend everything is still as glorious as it was in the beginning. But deep down, we know the gold has been plundered. We are tired of the constant polishing. We are tired of the sin of Jeroboam, choosing what is convenient over what is true. The healing of the 12 tribes didn't come from a new tax plan or a better army. It came from a king who was willing to be a servant. It came from the still small voice that Elijah heard in the cave. The voice that reminds us we are not alone, and that our worth isn't found in the gold we possess, but in the covenant we keep. The story of Israel is your story. It is a story of a family that was lost and then found, divided by pride and then gathered by love, broken by the law and then healed by grace. The gates of that New Jerusalem are standing open today. They are an invitation to set aside your bronze shields and your scorpions. They are an invitation to come home to a unity that doesn't depend on borders or bloodlines, but on a shared table where every lost tribe has a seat. But this healing doesn't happen by accident. It takes a certain kind of courage to stand against the decay of an era. It takes people who are willing to listen to the whisper instead of the roar of the crowd. Throughout history, whenever God's people have fallen into decline, He has raised up a voice to call them back. To truly understand how hope survives in seasons of total collapse, you have to meet the man who stood alone on the mountain. You need to discover how one man's fire can push back the darkness of an entire nation. You don't want to miss the full story of the Man of Fire. Watch the video on the screen now, the complete book of Elijah. You'll discover why he is one of the most powerful figures in all of Scripture, and you'll learn the secrets of how to stay faithful when everything around you is falling apart. Click the screen now. Your journey is just beginning.